Hello and welcome. Lots of faces I recognise and plenty of new faces as well. If I don't know you and we haven't met before, then my name's Anna Burley. I am the Policy Officer for the Co-operative Party and exploring a new career in hosting Zoom calls, which is what I spend a lot of my lockdown doing these days, which is great because it means I get to see lots of our cooperators, but also we get to host lots of fantastic guests. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. First off is that we record these sessions. That's because not everyone is able to join us live. So we put these up on YouTube to enable people to catch up on the information and the discussion after the event. So if you are wearing your pajamas or you don't want to be filmed, please turn your camera off now. You can do that if you go to the bottom left of your screen and click stop video, and then we won't be able to see your face at all. Broadly, your face will only come up on the video if you're asking a question, but just to be sure, I want to let you know so that you can avoid being filmed if that's important to you. The other thing to let you know is how to take part. So we're going to hear from Kate, who is on the call already, and Seema Malhotra, who will be with us shortly. And after that, we will have time for question and answers. So save up your questions till they have finished. To ask a question, given you're all on mute and I can't see all of you at the same time, you can put your hand up virtually using the participate button at the bottom of your screen. So if you go to the bottom, you've got a participate button, you can click there and there's a blue hands up option. So if you haven't used Zoom before and want to experiment, you can put your hand up now without risk of me calling on you immediately, just to give it a go. But it's very straightforward. Mary, I can see your hand up. Fabulous. Don, great. Nice one. Susan, lovely. So I think you got the hang of it. Stick your hand up. There's also a reactions button where you're able to sort of clap and put a thumbs up. And there's also a chat function. And my colleague Izzy, who's the purple bee, and myself will be watching the chat function to be able to monitor any queries or questions, and I'll be able to call on you from using that as well. So please do engage and send us your thoughts and stick your hand up when you want to ask a question afterwards. Oh,
sorry.
I've got a few of you keep unmuting. Please can you keep muted because it helps us listen to the speakers without any background interruption. Right, so I think that's my main housekeeping. Without too much further ado, we will kick off on the main event. We're going to be talking about workplaces today, following lots of information in the news and from the government about a want to open up workplaces and measures for easing lockdown. There's obviously a lot of concern and debate to be had about what's going to make that a safe reopening and what we need to do to make sure our workplaces are a place that workers can go without fear of getting sick while still earning a living. So Kate is here from Community the Union. Community are one of the subscribers to the Co-operative Party and we work very closely with them. So we're really, really thrilled to be able to work with them for our Zoom call. And Kate is the Head of Research, Policy and External Relations. So we're going to kick off with Kate. Who's going to give us a bit of context and information, and she's far more knowledgeable about this than I am. And then when Seema joins, we'll invite her in as well to sort of comment on some of Kate's contributions and talk about some of the work that she's been leading as Shadow Minister for Employment in Parliament. So without further ado, over to you, Kate.
Lovely, thank you, Anna, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening and getting your evening to hear about safer workplaces and job retention. As Anna outlined, I'm Kate from Community Trade Union. We're a general trade union, so we represent members across all sectors of the economy in the UK. And we're really proud to be an affiliate of the Co-operative Party and to be working really closely with you on loads of issues. So just to give you a bit of background about who our members are and where they work, and to set the scene slightly so you can sort of understand the work I've been working on the past 2 months and that our members and our union reps have been working really hard day in, day out on. So we represent a diverse range of members from the justice, custodial and immigration sector, so prison officers, to manufacturing workers and steel workers, betting shop workers, social care workers, road operators, charity and logistic workers, finance and professional, and more recently, over the past few years, those who are self-employed. And they obviously work in a mixture of sectors across the UK economy. So it's a real diverse mix, and which means that our response and reaction to the current pandemic has been really diverse too. A lot of our members have either been furloughed or they've returned to work, and some have been unfortunately made redundant. So this has required our response to be really fluid and really sort of on the ball, as you can imagine, in making sure that we're providing the right advice and supporting our members in their work day in and day out. And it's also presented a lot of challenges working across government and with employers to get it right too. So what I thought would be helpful to do is to give you a bit of an overview about my perspective from the job retention scheme and our members, and then touching on the recent guidance from the government about returning to work safely and what we think the gaps, where we think the gaps still are and what we think still needs to be done. So in terms of the current situation, we've got 8 million workers across the country that are currently benefiting from the job retention scheme, paying out more than 11 billion since its launch last month. It's absolutely massive and it's unprecedented in the world of work, and especially in the UK in terms of responding and supporting workers through a crisis. And it shows how necessary and important it is that that scheme is provided and there to support workers. But we can't ignore the fact that still millions of workers are missing out. For example, those who are recently employed, and you estimate that's about 2 million workers. And those who are already unemployed, what support they're receiving, and what they're living off every week outside of a pandemic, I think has come to surface too. And aside from those unemployed and employees, the self-employed, we've been working hard over the crisis and over the past few months and years in making sure that self-employed people get the same treatment as employees. We think it's only fair, and that they do so, and many of our members are currently battling through this crisis with no support at all. So the 2 million people so far have applied for the government's self-employed income support scheme, which is a great success, and as similar to the job retention scheme, shows how necessary it is. But there are still so many people who are missing out, and we're working day in, day out to plug those gaps and help those self-employed people get support. So those, for example, who are recently self-employed or who's run as limited companies and pay themselves through dividends. So that's the current situation from sort of the UK perspective, and where the gaps still lie, and where at Community Trade Union we're working really hard to plug them and make sure that all our members get the support they need, and all their colleagues and employees also do as well, that benefit from a trade union in their workplace. So on the job retention scheme and what needs to happen now, I think as I've said before, the government should be applauded for the introduction of it. In consultation with trade unions, businesses, it was revolutionary, and I think the Chancellor is probably the most popular person in government at the moment. And that sort of scheme and that approach to work should be a foundation in which I think we should build the employment infrastructure for years to come. And the extension of it to October was really welcome. This week, I think, was the cut-off and deadline for employees to start consulting on redundancy. And if not this week, it'd be very soon for those who had lesser employees or fewer employees. So this extension to October was really welcome, and it's good to see the government leading it and letting people prepare and employers prepare. But there's lots that we still don't know about the scheme beyond August. So they've told us that it will remain the same till the end of July, that employers will have to start topping up to reach that 80% from August onwards. We still don't know how much employers are expected to top up and what that will look like, and we think that needs to be urgently announced from the government to enable employers, trade unions and businesses to properly prepare and make sure that those workers will still have a job at the end of summer. Months seem to go by either really fast for a lot of people who are worried about their work week by week, and for trade unionists like myself, it's this constant worry. So we need that guidance urgently, even though it's a few months down the line. People need to start preparing now. We don't know if small employers will have to pay the same as large employers, and many companies that we work with, particularly smaller manufacturing companies who are keeping people on their jobs and preventing redundancies, really urgently need those answers and that solution. And the government have hinted towards looking like short-time working from August onwards, which is welcome, really welcome, and what we've been calling for to make the job retention scheme work in practical terms when the wider economy does return to work safely. For example, rotating people from working 1 week on and off rather than the current 3-week minimum period that currently exists. And we've called that particularly for the steel sector because it's going to be vital for our steel workers in that industry going forward. And we'll sort of provide that flexibility and boost for the sector and for the workers that they do urgently need to retain those skills and to keep the industry going. So on all those above points, as I've said, employers urgently need advance warning and time to prepare. And without that insight, I think it'll be quite a difficult few weeks and months ahead, even though they are still going to be protected going forward. Also from August, there's also some clear gaps that we're calling for, in terms of that we don't know what the wage subsidies will be for disabled and vulnerable workers and what that could look like. So far we've heard from charities and social enterprise employers that the plan to bring the job retention scheme to an eventual close come autumn does not actually include an exemption for vulnerable workers. Now there's millions of people who are vulnerable workers that aren't shielding that will be really concerned about going back to work, and I'll touch on that a bit later when I talk about safety and return to work. But that's just one example where something like the job retention scheme will keep vulnerable people in work and in employment, and the government have to get it right. To cut off something like the income support scheme and the job retention scheme will totally defeat why the government introduced it. So I do think really due consideration has to be given to the future of the scheme and the future of protecting jobs. You know, if we don't get it right, then we will face a huge unemployment crisis, and I think we're already on the path, and it's already looking inevitable, unfortunately. Andy Holden at a select committee this week made that quite clear himself from the Bank of England, suggesting that we're at risk of returning to high unemployment levels of the 1980s, and that's really concerning. You know, at the peak that was 3 and a bit million people. So there's lots that we need to do still to get it right, especially for younger people in terms of unemployment, who will probably be hardest hit by this crisis. I think it was a Resolution Foundation that released research recently that showed that 1 in 3 young people have been furloughed or lost their jobs completely. So there's a range of stuff I think the government needs to get right in terms of making sure that people don't have to worry and don't have to be anxious about their jobs in the future, and that there is a lot that we can do to guarantee that and to give them that satisfaction, that reassurance that they really, really urgently need. In terms of when we return to work and the safety of returning to work, a lot of our members, as I've outlined, have been working throughout this crisis, from our steel workers and those in logistics to our prison officers who are key workers on the front. There are a lot of people that are constantly been working, and we've been working with employers to make sure that they can work safely. And that's my first plug, is that being part of a trade union can guarantee that you will be treated fairly and that you'll be at work in safe terms and conditions. But outside of that, unfortunately, a lot of people don't have trade unions in their workplaces. And, you know, I think one thing before I go further into the safety of return to work and what needs to be done from the government is that having that trade union there and having a trade union support you throughout any problems that you might face. And your work has been at the forefront, and it's been actually really, really promising to see so many people turn to trade unions and say, you know, how can you help me and how can we work together to make my workplace better? So on the actual practical guidelines from the government on returning to work, you know, I'm yet to speak or meet someone who didn't find the Prime Minister's statement confusing. And then what came the week after, and days later actually was even more confusing. You shouldn't return to work on Monday, it's Wednesday. A lot of our members were confused. Should I turn up to work tomorrow? When I'm meant to go back to work, with employers saying, should I be calling my employees in? So I think telling people that they have to be back the next day without publishing guidance was really responsible for the government. And they didn't need to confuse people the way they did. A lot of people are already anxious, extremely anxious about returning to work and what their work looks like. So I think that was quite irresponsible from the government, and it's been good to see the guidelines finally published and working with trade unions to make those guidelines a lot better. But the narrative around the guidelines has to change, from our opinion. Securing a safe return to work guided by a full risk assessment has to be the priority. And we've got to hear that narrative from government and from employers, that they are actually understanding what has been asked of them and required of them. Because at the moment, the government seems to be saying that all reasonable steps have to be taken by employers to help people work from home. But if you can't work from home, and if your workplace has been told to close, has not been told to close, then you should go to work. Even me explaining that, I managed to muck that up. But I think it shows how unclear it is, and that employers need that guidelines, and they need good and best practice from employers who are doing it, so employers can get a picture and an idea of what that does look like, and to make that strong enough. We also don't think the government guidelines on returning to work is strong enough for vulnerable workers who are not shielding, as I've mentioned a couple of minutes ago. Just saying that social distancing should be taken in the workplace isn't good enough, in my opinion. It needs to be clearer with how vulnerable people should be encouraged to continue working from home, and they have to be part of those risk assessments. And we do urge employers to publish those risk assessments so they can be viewed and join their colleagues across the trade union movement who are calling for similar. We also echo a lot of the comments made from the union movement with regards to equality issues in the guidelines, and how workers who might be more vulnerable to the virus because of their age, their gender, or their ethnicity. BME workers and ethnicity was not actually covered in enough detail in the documents, and I don't actually think it's mentioned across the 8 government guidelines and detailed documents. And that's a real problem. A lot of the signs are showing that BME workers are impacted a lot more due to coronavirus and are more likely to die from the virus. And that's an absolute scandal that has to be explored and has to be looked into. I think guidelines have to be included of how your ethnicity is impacted at work and how that can be prevented through health and safety measures. Has to be at the forefront of government guidelines, and trade unions are calling for that, and we probably won't stop until we see some movement on that from the government. So they're sort of our key areas that we're looking to plug the gaps on, and we've been in conversation with the government today on that, and any issues that our members constantly feed through, we are working to that and working with employers to make sure that workplaces are safe when they do return to work. And we do work with good employers who want to get this right, and it's been a really positive experience working with them and then providing feedback to us about how we can help with our members and our reps to make workplaces safer. But also for those who are working from home, and how we can make sure that reasonable adjustments are still provided and that colleagues and our members are still supported when working at home through different health and safety measures. Particularly this week, it's Mental Health Awareness Week, and we've been working with employers to make sure that employees are supported with their mental health, that they are given guidance of where to go to get support. And we think that mental health is going to be a key issue returning to work, and whatever the future world of work and the next year looks like, it will be absolutely pinnacle into supporting people across the country and making sure that we don't have a mental health crisis as well as a physical health crisis, and that they are acknowledging that they are really interlinked. So I'll quickly sum up about what I think needs to happen and what community thinks needs to happen, and then it'd be great to sort of hear your views, and if you've got any points that you'd like to raise or any feedback, then please send it through. So just to quickly summarise, at this time, we think the most important thing is staying as safe as possible. That guidance hasn't changed from the trade union, it hasn't changed from workplaces and the union movement across the country, and that you shouldn't fear raising health and safety issues at your workplace. But if you do, and if you do have concerns about the health and safety of workplaces, we're telling everyone and our members to raise them with your union rep. And if you don't have a union rep, to raise it with your employer. That's absolutely vital going forward, and a really, really important step to take if you are worried about the health and safety of your workplace. We're pleased that the guidance include those risk assessments, and it includes stronger language on risk assessments and that expectation from employers. And we think that will play a really, really crucial role going forward, and we're working on that with a lot of our employers at the moment. But importantly, that all sectors just can't be treated the same. There's got to be a differentiated scheme for vulnerable workers, as I've mentioned, if we're going to get this right, and every sector has to be addressed in different ways. We need to give people the confidence that it's safe to return to work when it is to do so, and for them to know the actions they've got to take if any problems arise. And we need plans from the government about rebuilding after this crisis, how we protect existing jobs, how we create new jobs, and how we can get our economy back up and running. There's lots of ideas floating around, particularly from the TUC, about the job guarantee scheme that sounds sensible, a 6-month job minimum with accredited training paid at a living wage. Things like that have to be considered, and they've got to the trade unions from the government to stop this divide in the world of work that this pandemic has exposed, and that your future shouldn't be determined whether you can work from home or not. And that's probably a key message that we've been proud to work with the government, and trade unions have too. And it's shown what can be achieved when government, businesses and trade unions work together to get solutions done. You know, from the introduction of the furlough scheme to actually working together to get this guidance right on safety and return to work has been vital. And that approach, it's evident that it works, and we hope the government continues to sort of recognise the importance of working with us, not only during beyond it too. There are so many issues we have to get right, and we think we can if we do work together.
Yes, thank you so much, Kate. And that was hugely comprehensive and really interesting perspective for us, because we often talk about the cooperatives, but it's good to be able to talk about the employees and more widely the economy beyond our sector as well. So I'm really thrilled that we've also got Seema here. Seema Malhotra is one of our top cooperative MPs and has recently been made Shadow Minister for Employment. So I've unmuted you, Seema. If you want to sort of pick up on anything that Kate said, some of the work that you've been leading in Westminster, albeit remotely, and what you think we need to be doing next, or really freelance and go in any direction you think best, but it'd be great to hear your perspective, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you very much to the Co-op Party and also to community. And you know, it's a real pleasure to follow Kate. I think Kate laid out so many of the issues incredibly coherently and effectively, and I think brought together the challenge of where we are right now. I think drawing on what's being said by commentators, whether it's the Bank of England or the OBR and other commentators now about how long and how deep the recession's likely to be, is important, because if we're not realistic now, then we won't plan for what could be the worst outcome. And I think with the unemployment figures that we saw today, I think it's increasingly an imperative for the government to plan for a worse scenario rather than planning for the best scenario, because we'll just end up kind of lurching from pillar to post, as I do believe that we've done with the health crisis. It's been one kind of reactive turn after another, rather than saying what's the pathway likely to be and how effectively are we planning ahead. I think it is also an important time in which we've seen the TUC, government and industry working together. And in a sense, that's kind of a really important sign of the times, and it's got to continue, and it's got to continue with openness and honesty, because the problem we have right now is it isn't just a case of you know, one week or 1 month, or 1 year. This is a case of the decisions not being made correctly and swiftly by the government in consultation will have knock-on consequences for much longer. And the need to work together is much greater than I think any of us have known in our time in politics. What that means as well is that you've got to have government that's listening to what's going on. And you know, the issues that we've seen on the health side and the health crisis around PPE and around the crisis in care homes has often been born out of the government wanting to avoid a challenge that it couldn't quite face or be ready to deal with. And it's almost been easier to not look at the detail and try and think you'll just be able to get by for this week's headlines. And you know, it feels sad to say that, but I think, you know, today when you hear people talking about what Therese Coffey is starting to say, where she was starting to say, well, if the science was wrong, when maybe we made the wrong decisions, is not really the right admission for a politician, because what you've got to say is, I'm taking advice, but where is the counter advice, and how am I challenging the advice that I'm taking so that I'm sure it's correct? And in the end, the responsibility for those decisions lies with the politicians making them. So I'm a bit surprised still that it was Jonathan Ashworth who in the chamber was very slowly and gently and respectfully challenging some of the early decisions being made and saying, look, you're making this based on scientific advice, but there are other scientists who have counter views. So how are we listening to all the voices, and how are you coming to the conclusions that you are? And that is truly the spirit in which I know the front bench is continuing, but it's got to be not a bunker mentality of government, but a transparent and open one, where I think slowly those doors are being prized open. And I think with greater challenge now about publish the evidence that you're seeing so that that can be peer reviewed, and we don't have scientists setting up an alternative stage on YouTube because they're not feeling like there's that scrutiny. So if I come to the economy, I think we're at a turning point in that conversation, or at least I hope we are. A month ago, I wrote a piece, Times Red Box piece, where I argued that there needs to be an employment strategy as part of the exit strategy, because we can't take for granted the view of the OBR that there's going to be some sort of bounce back relatively quickly. And it will lead to us being complacent if we don't look at the other counter views to that, and what some of the researchers and academics are saying about what could be the longer term impact and also the depth of the recession. And as part of that argument that I made a month ago, I said that one of the critical pieces we need to do was a piece of strong analysis over where was the impact likely to be, what were the projections, what was the impact in terms of sectors, in terms of demographics, and in terms of geography. Because what history shows us as well is that unemployment might land more in certain areas. When you have a strategy that needs to respond, you need to know much more about where the issues and the risks are in order to be able to plan effectively for what your interventions are going to need to be. And in reality as well, we know that local active employment strategies can often work more effectively because you understand the local economy, you understand the local people, and you understand the local dynamics. So the work that is currently going on in local authorities, I know across the country, even though they have suffered in the same way of having, take my local authority as one example, under austerity, they lost 60% of their budget in the course of 10 years, and now are finding themselves spending £20 million more than they have over just dealing with the immediate crisis. But what they are having to do is to look at what the impact is likely to be, particularly of the slowdown in aviation, because Heathrow is our neighbour. My constituency begins on the southern side of just below the southern runway, and so on the southern side of Heathrow there is a fence, and that is the gap between my constituency and Heathrow. So the reality of what the employment impact could and will be, where previous research has shown that that 40% of our local jobs are dependent on Heathrow, is incredibly serious for where unemployment is likely to land and be very concentrated and for a long period of time. So our local authority is certainly working with other councils at doing a local impact assessment and are doing something very quickly. But what surprises me is the government hasn't produced as much as I would have thought they would be able to have at this point, because we know where, or they will know certainly, where the furloughing has come in from, what companies, what size of companies, with the millions that are on that scheme now as well. They're not all going to be going back to work. Some may be in June, some may be in October, but that pathway back into employment is going to be a long tail. And I think the points that Kate made about where the scheme's going to go next are very much the points that our front bench has also been making. Where and how much are employer contributions going to be, and how long for? Is October going to be another cutoff point? Are we going to see some drop in and drop out of furlough if we're going to see cycles of lockdown and release? How are we going to make sure that there are other programs combined with furlough, whether that is in training or reskilling, that could be helpful for those that maybe longer before they go back into work? But what we've got to avoid as well is the de-skilling that could come from a nation out of work for 6 months in so many different spheres. So tackling the de-skilling, planning for the skilling, and thinking about a strategy for how we're going to look for where the jobs are going to need to come from in the future. There is some very important work that Kate also mentioned that's gone on with the TUC, other organisations as well, some very important research from the Institute for Employment Studies that's been looking also at some of the past employment programs that have come in. We're certainly doing analysis of what's happened in the last 40 years, because in the 1980s there was a cycle of interventions, some of which have been drawn on today. I mean, short-time working and schemes even as far back as, the late 1970s, and what happened through the Thatcher years, and then what happened into the Labour years, and how Labour both built on and drew up new programmes, some of the New Deal programmes as well towards the end in the 80s as well, sorry, the 90s as well. But also looking at the Future Jobs Fund that came in after 2008. That was a programme that, in a sense, we're in a time now when you've got to take some politics out of this, because that programme, which David Cameron cancelled in 2011, was evaluated by the DWP itself and the DWP Select Committee in 2012 as having had some of the best cost-benefit analysis in terms of how much it saved in terms of benefit payments, but also how much it drew in terms of tax receipts from those who went into employment. So we've got to somehow look at the evidence. I mean, if the government's in a space of being led by the evidence, then I think this is a space in terms of employment where the government's got to be led by the evidence of what works, where I know, and you know, and we all know that they're in the space of Boris being also tugged by his right-wing free marketeers, who are leading the charge, as this happening in America as well, to go back to work despite the health risks, to quote unquote sort of save the economy, rather than seeing that our health journey and our employment and our economy journey has to go hand in hand, and that we've got to look at the release from lockdown alongside the safety for everybody in society. So just in drawing on that as well, I think what is important is the work going on with the trade unions, particularly around ensuring safety at work. And Andy McDonnell has been raising this very clearly from the beginning. I raised this in DWP questions as well at the start of the week, because in my view, what we've got to see is employers not just having a safe workplace, but safe workplaces that command the confidence of their employees. And that means, in my view, having an assessment that is done and having an assessment that is published so that there can be some scrutiny over what's going. And that scrutiny is also what will give confidence to employees. It's also what will give confidence to local public health officials and local HSE officials as well, who will need to work with our public health teams and local authorities that have taken on far more of a role than anyone would have expected them to do. And I may say, just a few years after the government cut in year 100 million from our national public health budget. So the resilience that we had anyway in our local authorities, both for dealing with the crisis after years of austerity, in our public health teams for dealing with the crisis, in our NHS for dealing with the crisis with a government that did not plan ahead for a pandemic, even though it was in front of them in black and white for years, basically because I don't think they understood what a pandemic was or could be, from what I've heard ministers say. A lot of that will obviously come through, and it has already through what media have put in front of ministers. But there is a very important point now about how we're going to build the resilience for the next phase, how we're going to increase the capacity and resources around our public health teams, working in conjunction with health and safety teams, how we're going to ensure that employers have some strong and common guidance, which is now been published but needs to be, I think, further refined, but how that's going to be done in partnership, because this is a place where we're all in it together, and we cannot have a situation in which employers are not challenged and yet they have still a lot of discretion about what they deem as a safe workplace. I think just to close on a couple of points as well, which I think are important, some of the issues that have come up in this period and will continue, and where I think the close working between all of you who are on this call, our trade unions, the co-op movement, to make sure that we can feed this in and be working with government, safety of particular groups as well at the workplace. So one issue that's come up is the categorization of pregnant women. Are they deemed a vulnerable group or not? Because the requirements of employers to make particular arrangements for those that are deemed vulnerable, are greater. And so that is an ongoing battle which I raised with the minister last week, and who is coming back to me on what the policy position is. And the point I raised with her is that where you've seen 3 pregnant women die, 2 of which were BME, and I think the statistics will be increased since then, You know, this is not something that we can just assume is something that's at the discretion of an employer. If you are a responsible employer, you want to do the right thing. That in part depends on the right and clear messages coming from the government. And that does, I think, also lend itself to not just saying, I'm going to go behind what the evidence, what the scientists say today, but it does say where we're not sure, how do we err on the side of caution based on what we know to date, rather than something that's going to come in 3 weeks' time when we could have put people's lives at risk. So I think, just to close off, I think there are issues in relation to how we ensure that there is clarity around the vulnerable, how we ensure that we continue to support workers who do need to self-isolate and not put themselves in a position ongoing. There are MPs to which this applies as well, who are not necessarily MPs over 70. There are MPs who are younger, who have health conditions, where we are being told that we may need to go back on the 2nd of July. So for those MPs, some of my colleagues who I know have to self-shield as well, what is the message being given to employers? What are the guarantees being given that they should be able to continue to work at home if it is a risk to them? And how can we continue to make sure that where we're seeing the gaps in the resilience and the support coming through from our social security system, we recognise where that is weak, because that is one of the big learnings and lessons, that we have a social security system that is not fit for purpose for both the challenges that people face, where in a sense some of the issues have been easy to brush under the carpet and see as people who are unemployed who will get back to work as soon as they get on their bikes. The scale of this and the number coming into the social security system for the first time, and the expectation gap between what they thought would be fair and the sense in which it feels very unfair to them, is going to be, I think, an impetus to change, and an impetus in which the labour movement is far better placed to try and pull together with, based on our values, a system that should be working for the whole country, which is utterly, at the moment, I think, at odds with a government that is being pulled by its right wing to try and push under the carpet some of those challenges and say that if we just all get back to work, everything will be okay.
Great, thank you so much, Seema. That was equally comprehensive and a huge amount of food for thought there. We have a little time for questions. As I mentioned at the start, there's a participate button at the bottom, and you can put up a virtual hand, or you can type in the chat, which is what Andy Stoker has done. Andy, I'll unmute you so that you're able to ask a question.
Oh, you've put me on the spot there.
Oh, sorry, I can read it out if you'd prefer.
No, I'm just having a look at myself to see what marvellous things I wrote. Just making the very obvious point that people being asked or more like told to return to work, it's critical that they can see or better participate in a realistic and reliable risk assessment. Where there's effective union representation, this might happen, but this factor needs to be communicated very widely, especially for those without union support. People must be able to see the risks that will exist, or to know about the risks that will exist in every workplace.
Great, thank you. And I've got a hand up from Don. I will unmute you, Don.
Thank you.
Hi.
I just want to make a point. I mean, I think Seema's article in Red Box is really interesting. The idea of getting ahead of the curve seems to me absolutely crucial for Labour. The point too about lurching from pillar to post. If we're not careful, this government is, you know, I mean, person for person, they are so much less able than Labour's front bench, including Seema. And I do think there's an opportunity for the party to actually do the thinking, to talk about an industrial strategy and get out there while the Tories are doing the day-to-day stuff, which, you know, is obviously important, and Rishi Sunak has done stuff quite well. But overall, the Tory party are not going to think strategically in the way that we want to do and ought to do. So having, whether we call it at this point an industrial strategy, I mean, Theresa May was going to have one, so, you know, the language is there, but we ought to start doing that and give it some real, you know, real pillars to it. There's the sort of bits and pieces of it that make it a real forward-looking document. Climate change and all that, the New Green Deal, obviously part of it, and we're getting some of that. But I think there is a chance for us to establish a kind of intellectual leadership in the face of this rather lackluster Tory party.
Great, thank you very much, Don. And then I've got two more. One from Pauline. I will unmute you now, Pauline.
Hello.
Hiya.
Well, this is a personal story. Kate, you keep using the term that the press used today. He's talking about younger people with complete expectancy, nobody knows matters. And I'm of an age where we were taken to the pirate picture. I now have to work 7. And my age group who are still doing physical jobs, we were struggling before COVID came along. I got COVID, having enough work for
Pauline, I can't hear you very well. I don't know if it's just me. But I don't know if you're able to use the chat function at the bottom and type your note, because I think your connection's not great. So if you type your message and I'll read it out for you. And I've got the final one for this round from Mary Walsh. I will unmute you now, Mary.
Thank you. Yeah, my question was about government priorities, and probably everybody on this call would agree that over the last decade, you know, we've seen government after government that have had priorities for austerity and saving public spending, and what that's done to our NHS. At the same time, they've continued to spend billions on nuclear weapons. So my question is around whether the Labour Party and the trade unions are now thinking about how to redirect those resources, being very practical and very down to earth, about how those resources and skills and energy can be redirected out of the nuclear weapons industry into health and into community safety, and after the pandemic's over, into renewable energy and sustainable energy. Is that being thought about, please?
Great, thank you very much, Mary. So I will hand over to Kate and Seema to sort of cover any questions from sort of Andy, Don, anything you caught from Marie, and I'll let you know if she types. Sorry, Marie, and anything you heard from Pauline, and then sort of wrap up your sort of closing remarks in there too. And then anyone we haven't gotten to, you'll be able to email me questions on policy@party.coop, and I will seek to get you answers and circulate those. I don't know who wants to go first.
Say a few words.
Yeah, great.
I think they're all very, very helpful points. I think in terms of the risk assessment, I think I would absolutely agree with that from Andy. In terms of getting ahead of the curve and also where we might go on industrial strategy thinking, I think Don is absolutely right. I think this does tie with the point that Mary made. It's very much, I think, my view, our view, that we need to be rethinking industrial strategy. You know, we did have a view that was, I think, a very kind of robust work that we've done, thinking about our regional economy as well, with regional investment banks, and thinking about sort of more local and regional strategies and investment in sectors and different ways in which you would invest, and also where the co-op sort of co-op movement could play a part in that, because I do think we want to see the co-op movement, I think, having a sort of, this is a moment in which I think there is an opportunity for a resurgence as communities have come together in a different way, and how we sort of rethink the sort of message of cooperativism in the current time. And I do take the point that, in a sense, even where we were a year ago on industrial strategy has to be revisited. Ed Miliband did write a piece at the weekend and was talking about a sort of green industrial strategy. My view is that this is very much more urgently needed, and we have to accelerate some of the thinking around this, because part of how we come out of this situation and the recession is going to be how much the government is able to help with the creation of jobs. And so, as well as the job guarantee, I think one of the things that the figures show today is the massive disparity, you know, probably at least 600,000, you know, somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million in terms of vacancies to those actively likely, you know, seeking work at the moment. So even if everybody that, you know, wanted to managed to get it, you know, everyone that was applying for jobs, all those job vacancies managed to go, you would still have hundreds of thousands of people, if not more, unemployed. And that is with what's likely to come on stream over the next 3 months. So I think how the government and how the state uses its power and its resources to say these are priority areas for investment, for rebuilding our country, whether that's some of the infrastructure projects or it's investing in some of the, you know, either in science or maybe it's in other jobs where we know that we need to increase the support, whether it's you know, in the caring profession. There are many professions in both existing public services as well as in some of the, you know, the areas in which we need growth. And so how we bring the resources of the state behind that is a real role for the state. It's a political question that may be more of a challenge to the Tories, but certainly one in which I think we can leave some thinking in true sort of Labour and also Fabian kind of input and traditions, and work together on what that vision is. And I think the sort of green jobs part of this is a really important dimension. And I do think there's an opportunity over the next 6 to 9 months, when jobs may be more scarce, to look at how we can work with the unions on learning and training programs, and to see that as another offer from trade unions to workers in a very difficult time.
Great. And Kate?
Yeah, thank you. Echo a lot of Seema's points, and it's really encouraging and positive that I think Labour have a real opportunity to lead on what the industrial strategy looks like and how we rebuild from now. And a lot of what Seema mentioned, I was going to pick up on as well. But just to supplement it slightly from a trade union perspective, especially on industrial strategy and sort of going forward about priorities and what we'll be calling for. Our General Secretary, Roy Ricker, sits on the Government's Industrial Strategy Council. So we've been feeding through a lot of our thoughts about what that should look like and how we can hold the government to account on it at numerous opportunities. And our main and key theme that will continue to be is that people and workers have to shape it. They have to be at the centre of an industrial strategy, and it's even more important now, and I think has shown more than ever about how important that is. So a lot of points Seema made, you know, how do we create good green jobs and how do we bring people along with us to do that? How can we explain what the industrial strategy is, and do people even know about it? I think they're really, really key problems and things that we have to get right, and Labour's got a real opportunity to lead in it, to not only make sure how we can help those millions of workers who have been left behind in the current crisis, but who were left behind it before too. So this levelling up agenda from the government, I think it's 10 years too late in my opinion, but it's better late than never. And that urgency is really, really key. After this, I don't think there'll be any return to normality. Social distancing might continue for a number of years. And even after a vaccine is developed, we've still got lots of challenges from a recession and mounting debt, high unemployment, automation, climate change. There's loads of really key issues that we have to get right and work together on. I think Labour setting the agenda is a really positive and encouraging thing to do, and working with trade unions, we can hopefully build together a good offer for workers all over the country in different sectors across the economy, and no longer pretend that these divisions don't exist anymore, and actually put workers and people at the heart of what we do. So I think it's an opportunity and shows how important we do have to get it right.
Great. And Pauline, thank you so much for writing in the chat function. Sorry we didn't hear you. Just if either of you, Kate and Seema, had anything to add. Pauline's point was around how there's a lot of emphasis about young people when we talk about unemployment from this crisis, but actually a lot of workers are over 60 and sort of not necessarily feeling part of that narrative around getting people back into work. So just if you had any thoughts around how we need to make sure that we've got a strategy that works for all age groups of workers.
Yeah, I actually had a, oh sorry, Seema, do you want to go first? No worries. I actually had a paragraph on older workers that I missed out in my opening remarks, so thank you for asking that question, Pauline. And absolutely, it's younger and older workers that are really going to be impacted by this current crisis. And you know, both will need separate and key strategies to address the issues that we'll face in unemployment and the challenges that will arise over the next few months and that have already sort of shown through, particularly on reskilling, upskilling and retraining. As Seema already mentioned, you know, they're really, really important in getting people back into work and helping people to find the right routes about what might be best for them and what works for them. And we need a real strategy that works with local government, that works across all different levels of how we organise and making sure that people do feel supported and are not left behind. It's going to be really, really important in ensuring that older workers have those skills, that they feel supported, and that we can make sure that we do get it right for them as well.
Great. And any final comments on that one, Seema?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, you know, when I did use the term sort of demographics, I think the young and old is certainly a story that's come through. And with young people, there is a particular issue in that they may struggle to get onto the jobs ladder, and the research is showing how it could impact their incomes for a lifetime if you're slow getting on, and how you'll be able to move forward. And older people will face a different set of challenges, but I think what is really important for health and for mental health, but also I think you know, the other side of this is, you know, the people who plan for their lives for contributions to their pensions. The later years of your working years can be really important for your pension saving and your planning for your financial status in retirement. And so, you know, I think it's really important to think all the way through the working age as to how we're dealing with this, because otherwise we know that people end up in poverty in retirement, and that itself is a social justice issue.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate that I've kept you all longer than I promised, and that I'm eating into your tea time. So I think I'm going to call it an evening there. A huge thank you and virtual round of applause to Kate and Seema. We're really thrilled to be working with you, Kate, as one of our affiliated unions, and also with you, Seema, as one of our excellent cooperative MPs and members of the Shadow Cabinet team. So we're really very much lucky to have you both on today's call. Those of you who haven't joined one of our calls before, we hold lots of Zoom calls every week. On Wednesday lunchtime, we have a call looking at the different responses to coronavirus that have been taking place in Wales, as opposed to led by Westminster, with a particular focus around social care. And we'll be joined by the Wales Co-operative Centre and their Chief Executive, Derek, as well as a representative from Cartefi Co-op, who are a social care co-op who are on the front line of dealing with this crisis. In the evening, any councillors on the call, you are able to join our councillor call, where we'll be looking at how we can build on the huge amount of bottom-up community activity that this crisis has prompted people to get involved in, things like mutual aid groups. So please do keep involved, keep joining us, send me through any thoughts and questions. I'll be having a proper look at the chat today, and thank you very much for everyone who's gotten involved. And there are a few links there that I will be circulating to you afterwards, so I'll make sure that you've all got a copy of Seema's Times Red Box piece, because it sounds like it was well worth a read. Links on how to join a trade union, as Kate said, that's so important, and also some sort of other bits and bobs that were mentioned through the call. So a huge thank you for letting me steal your evening. Big thank you to our speakers. Stay at home and look after yourself and stay safe if you're going to work. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.